It's about to go down with Marc and Cathey, a live coaching show about dropping ideas. Marc and Cathey coach and have conversations with brilliant idea creators who are reimagining the world through the expression of their words, thoughts, and action.
Hey everybody, it's about to go down. I'm Marc Williams.
And I'm Cathey Armillas, and I'm so excited today. We have Marcus Carter with us today. He is a knowledge gatherer. He is a warrior of liberation. He's an organizer, he's a teacher. He's dedicated his life to transforming our culture and finding this space to make sure that liberation is happening everywhere. Marcus, your idea that you want to chat with us today is about the misrepresentation of race and racism. So tell us a little bit about that and let's get into your idea.
Yeah, first, honored and happy to be here with y'all and engaged in this conversation. When I think about how do we understand the miscalculation of race and racism, I'm explicitly thinking about why are we having the same conversations that we may have had 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years, 100 years ago, right? And that helps me understand that at some point, we are not catching the lesson, right? Unfortunately, we keep repeating, let's say if we talk about racism, right? Is racism supposed to be a racist group, right? Is it supposed to be a specific act someone does? And or how does it exist as an organizing structure? How does it exist as an ideology? How does it exist as a logic and rationale that helps organize our culture? Those are two separate things, right? And it's so maybe another point to add to this is like some people think becoming anti-racist simply means you don't discriminate against specific groups. But again, you might have certain policies that clearly discriminate against certain groups, or the omission of policies that help collapse disparities amongst certain groups.
So Marcus, really quick, just for our audience so that they know, Marcus, you spend like almost 100% of your time, like you're in a constant frame of mind of thinking about the ways in which people are being oppressed. And I know you personally. And so I know that array covers everybody in every aspect. And you spend so much time here and you have so much knowledge. Like there's so much that we could get in today. And but one of the biggest things I think that you talk about a lot that I would love for you to kind of touch on is the narratives and the way that we're hearing narratives right now today, narratives that were started hundreds of years ago. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and so one of the quotes I always highlight is an African proverb. I believe it comes from Nigeria, and forgive me, I don't know the specific location, but it says, until the lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter, right? And so if you're consuming content based on race and racism, what demographics is that information actually coming from? Right? Like, how is the history of race and racism different coming from, let's say somebody of the African diaspora versus someone who is not? What kind of nuances does a person highlight and or address? And so again, when we're talking about narratives, I think it's critical for us to observe who is actually telling the story. And I think it's human nature for us to sort of self-censor ourselves. Right? We just kind of experienced this as it relates to Juneteenth. It became a national holiday, and therefore America gets to observe it almost as a +1, right? But we know hidden in the story is this concept of, delayed, quote unquote, justice, right? Delayed, quote unquote, freedom, and that people are told 2 years after paperwork is signed that they are now officially, quote unquote, free, right? And so the self-censorship can make this a holiday, make it sound good because we can sell t-shirts, we can observe it, but we don't want to talk about the injustice hidden, not even hidden, explicit in the story, right? And so again, who's telling that story, right? The hunter, right? America, right? Who has colonized, a certain group, right? And is telling this story as if it's a +1. It's an extremely tragic story because we're not also highlighting that even if certain people were told they were freed, that doesn't mean they were granted, quote unquote, freedom, right? We know if the history of enslavement existed for how many centuries, that someone signing a paper then meant it's all good now? Come on, we have to be aware of what stories are, being fabricated within that kind of narrative, if you will.
Hey, Marcus, I got a question for you based on two things that you've said to give me clarity on the idea that you're sharing with us today. You started off by saying, why are we having the same discussions?
Mm-hmm.
You also just said, but we don't want to talk about it. So what's the connection between those two statements? Why are we having the same discussions and we don't want to talk about it? What's the connection between those two lines?
Yeah, so why are we having the same discussions and we don't want to talk about it? Well, just think about that quote about, the lion and sort of glorifying the hunter. If the logic we honor is based on the hunter, how are we getting to a different solution, right? It's like we almost can't even address it if we believe the narrative of, said country or said posture and position is always right. You can't even consider what the alternative is, right? And so like within this concept of like the miscalculation of race and racism, it's like, again, if you believe racism to simply be a specific act that someone is doing and not an actual process, not an actual logic, then how are we going to engage in the discussion? We can't, right? And so, maybe an example of this is like folks who have been in education, right? And education will give us this perspective that we're trying to close achievement gaps. How many years is it going to take to close achievement gaps? Notice that achievement gaps keep growing. Is it fair to say education doesn't exist to close achievement gaps? Right? And so, again, who's telling the story? What logic are we sort of building our rationale on consistently that distance us from other points of views, if you will? And so I consistently, see that in a number of conversations.
Hey, Marcus, I just had a thought that I never thought of before. I hear you talk all the time, and it just hit me that because there's so many examples of us like telling the narrative or believing the narrative from, from a certain narrative and then, understanding things to be true.
Sure.
I've heard you say so many times to challenge everything that comes your way, every little thing. Mm-hmm. But is there any model of anything anywhere where where the narrative has changed and a positive outcome has come from it? Do we have anything that we can look to and go, oh, there was a narrative problem here, but it adjusted and changed and there was a good outcome from it?
That's interesting. I don't have an immediate example that's going to maybe like one-to-one make sense. I will say, being a student of history and thinking about the different ways things have been maybe co-opted and appropriated and how they were a +1, but had to be dismantled to be a +1 for someone else. And so what I'm speaking towards explicitly is think of like the Black Panther Party, right? And they initially started as the Black Panther Party for self-defense. A lot of people don't know that the breakfast programs that they instituted, you had certain schools and areas around Chicago that adopted that. Right? But first, the government worked to dismantle them and then take advantage of that program. But that program was based on, self-determination and understanding that hunger, poverty, all these things that are manufactured, how do we create a baseline and a safety net, mutual aid and things of that nature to help people survive, right? Because these were called survival programs, in hopes that they could then take advantage of education, et cetera, et cetera. Like a lot of people just think of, whatever movie or sort of Hollywood version of the Black Panthers that don't understand that some of these programs, the party was dismantled, but these other entities actually extracted some of the good and then picked those up. And it seems like, hey, offering kids free lunch and breakfast and things at school is just normal, but it actually came from this group, if you will.
Cathey, you said something a little bit earlier. You asked that really resonated with me. You used the term narrative problem. And so, Marcus, I'm wondering, is there a narrative problem? And it sounds like there is, right? There's a narrative problem. And one thing that I've noticed in my years is that it's so fascinating to finally find or hear these narratives that we have not heard before, right? Like you said, we've always heard the narrative of the hunter, but we have not heard the narrative of the lion. I'm wondering, in terms of your idea, how do you suggest we discover the narratives that have not been told? Or where do we go to start telling the narratives that have not been told?
Yeah, so that's a large question, and I think it's important for us to have a foundation here that we may have skipped, and then I want to come back to this. One is that we have to understand that solutions are often shaped by the way problems are defined, right? And so who gets to define what the problem is, right? Like, think about the hunter. Like, how are they defining the problem, and for who is the problem? This is easy for us to, maybe not easy, but we could absorb this as it relates to, protests, Black Lives Matter, and things of that nature. Clearly, a specific demographic are saying policing is not helping. Policing is terrorizing the community, right? But who gets to determine that, no, policing is actually good for you? One group is clearly saying it's not. It has been destructive on multiple levels. And then are the rest of us just to say, like, no, we actually know what is best for you, therefore you're going to continue to receive these kinds of resources? That's problematic. And so again, think about who is the group and or ideology that is defining the problem? And is that actually the majority opinion? Does that actually reflect the majority of folks who are there on the ground? And, from a larger standpoint, we understand this within race and racism. With all due respect to allies, but do you appreciate the allies' analysis over racism, over those who have been targets of racism? That's odd, right? That is extremely odd to say, hey, I actually am going to validate, let's say in the most sort of offensive and realistic black and white, spaces, like I took the white person's analysis of race and racism over the Black person's. How problematic would that be?
Yeah. Yep.
And so, I've said this before. It's like, think of how we tell history and, the institution of enslavement here in America, right? And I talk about how, like, somehow we've gotten it in our mind that Lincoln signed a piece of paperwork and that then freed everyone. But whose agency is actually being stripped out of that story? Well, Black people, African people who always left the plantation. And therefore, that did not validate the social scientists and the scientists of that time that used to try to prove, hey, Black people are an inferior, and therefore they should be doing this kind of work, et cetera, et cetera. So again, thinking about, like, how are these solutions being shaped? How is the problem being articulated, and who is actually articulating the problem? That's like me showing up to your house and saying, Mark, you ain't doing it right here. Right?
What you talking about?
Exactly.
You're running this whole family thing wrong. You're not doing it the right way.
Exactly.
Marc, one of the things that we're always trying to do, and Marcus is this, I would say he's this, I hate to say it, like extreme Kate, like he's in a person that's in a different mind frame than a lot of other people, meaning he's thinking about his idea constantly in every way that it affects every person. He's living and breathing the idea that he's talking about constantly. That automatically puts him in a much different place than many people that we that we're coaching. Like somebody wants to give a TED talk and it's okay. They give one TED talk and then they're like, okay, I washed my hands. I'm done. Like I did it. I gave my TED talk. Marcus wants to get out there and say to everybody. And so like, I'm thinking about this idea on such a grand scale that I had this thought, and this is just a psychological way to turn this. But what do you guys think about? I feel like the problem is the way that you said something brilliant, Marcus. It says like we often define, solutions are often shaped by the way that problems are defined. What if we could start, because you could do this person to person, what if we could get every person to think about where is this story coming from? For instance, have you both ever heard somebody give a presentation or a speech and they'll say something like, they say that, they say that da 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 da, and they'll give some kind of information, and they use they at like, who's they? Who is they? Right. Who is they? Like,
yeah,
they is that they, like, to your point, Marcus, they is that this entity maybe of small group of people that are creating a narrative or a story that benefits them, but we don't question because somebody wrapped it with they. They said we should do this. They say we should have this. I don't know, Marcus, maybe we should attack ourselves, meaning like we should take this on ourselves to really, and you talk about this. So it's not that you don't talk about this already, right? But maybe the big challenge is to challenge everything.
Yeah.
Where's the story coming from? Who's telling it? Where did they get their information from?
Yeah, we have to challenge everything and make sure that our critical analysis is fluid and flexible. And so what I mean by that is, imagine someone of a different continent or country asking you to pronounce their name. And you pronounce it in an English accent. And they try to course correct you and say, hey, actually, here's how you pronounce it. And you can't catch it though, because you're so set on how you enunciate syllables, and you're just not open to the idea that certain letters are silent.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. And so that is what I catch people in all the time. Is like, how are you actually being open and absorbing? But more importantly, how are you removing yourself from your own sort of logic and rationale and wrapping around, someone else's story, if you would. I'll give you maybe an explicit example for me. And again, thinking about race and racism would be, I, like many people, had this idea that I would use the phrase, our founding fathers. How problematic is it for someone of African descent to refer to, especially white folks, whether ancestors or not, as founding fathers, right? And so some people will think this is an exaggeration, but I think if you know your history, it is actually a more accurate description of looking at people as pioneers of enslavement, pioneers of colonialism, right? Is that not a more accurate statement? And again, I don't understand why it would have to be problematic versus me being critical of how the narrative has been told to me. And me saying, look, I continue to look in books and I cannot consider someone who is willing to enslave others a founding father, not given that connotation and context.
Would someone who has a different opinion say to you, well, that's because of the way you're defining the problem? How would you respond to that?
Yeah. That's interesting until we look at historical fact around race and racism. Right? I haven't made up the narrative that founding fathers did enslave people. So we can use the sort of avoidance tactics and create a separate narrative. Or we can actually look at the facts, right? And so I'm never going to, not never, because we're all human, but we can understand these people as pioneers of enslavement, pioneers of colonialism, pioneers of so on and so forth, versus this idea of being founding fathers. What are you a founding father of? If settler colonialism is that, then I think that's fair to say, but that is not the follow-up observation.
Well, and maybe this is where the softening of language comes in, right? Like when an alternative narrative comes up, I mean, the narrative that we hear, and then we find out, especially if you go search on your own and you really go do historical research and you find out facts, like Marcus is saying, you're like, well, this actually happened, but the way that it's been softened, the language, and we're so used to hearing soft language,
Yeah. Another way of thinking about this, and again, still centering sort of, racism, is like how, and again, this miscalculation, how have our conversations around race and crime adjusted? Or are our conversations around race and crime similar to, Rodney King era or Watts riot or so on and so forth, right? Like we're regurgitating the same kind of arguments, right? And so we mentioned earlier me being an abolitionist, or at least an organizer. So I've organized around abolition, and I'm always critical on how many reforms are we going to say policing needs.
Yeah.
I'm going to have great grandkids, and we're still going to be talking about reform. How many Black lives must cease to exist in order for the reform to get right?
And the reform is about defining the problem and adding the narratives that have been missing.
That's an interesting observation or question, because I think there's two ways for me to receive that. One is typically the way we create reform here in the States is by actually expanding the thing we were hoping to change. And so we understand this within the context of policing because we've given the police more money. We've always done that. And so that type of reform is actually harmful. And again, so within the example of, let's say, policing and like how is the problem being defined, instead of thinking of people as, quote unquote, criminals and things of that nature, what are the alternatives people have asked for in terms of funding and resources within their community? How come we're not investing at billions of dollars based on their critique?
Yeah. Why aren't we funneling some of the money into reparation of things from of the past, or repairing some of the systems we know are broken, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And if those communities are volunteering that's where their needs are, I don't understand how we don't honor those things.
Yeah.
But again, if I believe, let's stick with the lion and the hunter. If I believe the lion has no agency in the story, right? If I believe the lion is illiterate, right?
Yeah.
Then I have the liberty to do all that I want, right? I'm going to continue utilizing that logic and that rationale and not understand that I am causing oppression to another group, if you will.
Sorry, I just had such a reaction to that image that you just brought up, or that statement, right? Part of the problem is how the lion is even viewed, right? Because you said, like, if we look at the lion as illiterate, well, then why would we even listen to the lion at all?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow.
It's separating yourself from the lion too, right? It's like you almost have to take a side in this story, even when you hear it, right? You're like, am I the lion or am I the hunter? Which it almost makes you, it's almost like a separating narrative just to begin with, I think.
But now let's roll with that for a second. Is that part of the problem, that we are separating the narrative of the lion from the narrative of the hunter? Is the idea to be able to tell both narratives? Like, how do we all, I mean, if the goal is to get on the same page, are we aiming to be able to tell both narratives? And if so, what do we need to do to get there?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. And I want to be critical in that at times it's hard to project, linearly what will happen if we have first never told both sides of the story in the first place. Right? And so it's like, first and foremost, let's just be mindful of when the discourse only tells one side of the story. And then let's give us each other some grace, if you will, and understanding. And how do we develop not only a story or a narrative, but also an outcome and a different solution based on having both sides, right? And being able to determine what is fact, but more importantly, being able to assess, why do we continue to create disparate outcomes between certain groups? I think that's necessary. It's hard for me to say, hey, here's what we'll do next, if we haven't done even the next step, right? It's like, how do you actually you take a step one, but do you know how to, let's say if you took a step with your right foot and the left foot is leading, what is the length and the stride of the next step? Will it be exactly the same or will it be slightly different?
Yeah.
Right? We have to slowly give each other some space to start to calculate those things, because I think, again, the logic of the hunter, if you will, is sort of like go, 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 very binary, right? Kill or be killed. And I'm just willing to say, actually, I think there's many more options in between there. And if we listen to the other group or the other person associated with it, this story, they'll show you that there are actually other options.
Yeah. Something I thought of too, and Marcus, I want to, for the audience, I want to bring it back to this idea too. Like, if you were giving this TED talk, like, I know it's not something, this is not something you can give a talk and you can fix. That's not how it happens, but you can start to change the way people think. I mean, I hear you speak a lot and you change my mind constantly. I hold and retain so much knowledge thanks to, your words and a lot of the time and energy you spend studying the past and learning the truth. And so I appreciate you on so many levels. Another thing hit me today. It hit me today that when the story makes it so separated that I have to find myself, when you go watch a movie and you're like, you get into the whole movie, you come out of the theater and you're like, oh, it's daytime. God, I was in this whole nighttime movie. You get into everything, right? You get into the time of day, you get into the character's perspective, how they're living their life. So you're kind of in the main character. The second these narratives are told that force me to be different than you, I can easily do something to you and not feel bad because the narrative has completely separated us, right? And so you're not me, but if I can be you for a second, if I can understand the narrative through your eye, like, you're me and I'm you, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, I get to be you for a second because I understand it. And that's what good storytelling does.
Mhm.
I get to be, I'm not just hearing your story, I'm reliving it with you. You know what I mean, Mark? Because that's a big story. That's a big storytelling thing that we teach. Don't be a news reporter and don't tell everybody the news. Have people relive it with you. Anyway, just a thought that I have, because I started to feel like when I'm in a space where I'm living the other narrative, I understand it. I digest it. I can feel it. I have a different perspective.
Yeah, that's a lot to process. And part of me just thinks, I'm going to butcher another proverb, but I think it in some ways is, I think it says, if it is in, I think it's talking about like illnesses and things of that nature. And it's something along the lines like, if it is in the tree, then it is in our neighbor, right? And just literally trying to highlight that, like, don't think that someone's oppression is just theirs and only theirs. Audre Lorde reminds us that all oppression is connected, right? And so we're somewhat short-sighted when we think these things must only be happening to one group over another group. And so, even in our conversations around race and racism as a collective, are we to believe only marginalized groups are suffering due to racism? There's actually studies out there that show that white groups actually have, by not talking about racism, not engaging in that, they have a lower empathetic ability and understanding, with marginalized groups. Like there's a whole, research out there that articulates, okay, what is happening to the person and or demographic that is quote unquote the oppressor? And so when we watch these narratives on the news, I don't want to be empathetic to certain groups, but what is happening to the officer who could just kill someone and in a matter of time be back on the streets?
Yeah.
Right? Any of us who understand trauma can say, hey, I don't think this is a +1 in this scenario.
Yeah.
Hey, Marcus, as we tackle this, the thing that keeps coming to my mind, the thought that I have is the people who need to engage in this conversation, and even the difficulty that some may feel in having the conversation. As a matter of fact, like you said, by not talking about it, it creates a greater level of understanding, right? And so it makes me think, well, why are people not talking about it, right? What are we missing in terms of the gateway that then makes people feel comfortable enough to talk about it? You started off talking about the miscalculation of racism, and I'm wondering if part of that miscalculation is whatever is getting in the way of telling the story. So I'm wondering, what idea is it that you have about how do we get people who need to hear this? How do we get through to them? How do we get them to engage in the conversation?
Yeah, that's a kind of forces me to be deep in thought, because I question the significance and or insignificance of wanting to, and not that you said this, but I think this is sort of the mainstream observation when people ask those questions, is like, do we need to actually convert people? Right? And understanding how harmful that is in and of itself, whether this is politics, whether this is, religion, whether this is, a lot of different thoughts, is like, how harmful is that kind of logic and rationale? How much harm have we ourselves viewed in trying to quote unquote convert people? And so I don't know, my mindset kind of thinks to, how are we creating systems and climates, cultures that do provide space for everyone? When I talk about being in pursuit of liberation, I don't just mean for myself or as a member of the, African diaspora. I mean, how do we create liberation for everyone? How do we actually reduce the harm and these widening gaps and disparities and outcomes? I don't know if I myself can speak on behalf of everyone for that. Part of me being inclusive and equitable is giving people the space to volunteer how they see that playing out for themselves. And so I don't say that as a cop-out. I say that as I've already witnessed the harm associated with one person speaking on behalf of everyone, acting as if they are a monolith and not giving people space to say, hey, I have agency in my own existence. And here's what might work best for my, demographic, for my identity, for, what I need to thrive in these spaces.
You just inspired me to write this down, and I'm not sure if it truly captures your thoughts, but it's not about conversion, it's about a conversation. But how do you reduce that perceived threat of conversion, right? Because I think about debates and very heavy topics, right? And it's like, I don't want to talk to Marcus about this because he's going to try to change my mind and try to convert me. I don't want to go to this church because they might say something and it's going to convert me. I don't want to talk to this Cathey lady because she might say something and convert me. And we get so caught up on, are you trying to convert me? Are you trying to change my opinion? Are you trying to challenge me? Are you trying to say I'm wrong? Are you trying to say this? Are you trying to say that? That all gets in the way of the conversation. So it's very interesting that you said that, because it made me think, how do we reduce this perceived threat of conversion so that we can actually have a conversation and hear the narrative and actually see the other side of the discussion?
Wow, Marc, that was it's so brilliant how you pulled that out. And of course, I love your showmanship on that, the whole, it was really good, because it was like, oh yeah, that's kind of the internal thing that you feel. But Marcus, I thought you really kind of punched me in the heart a little bit when you said this. It really softened me so much when you were like, I see the weapon that was used that created this situation. I don't think I want to step up and use the same weapon, even though it's a terrible fight. I just don't want to do it. So, I think that was such a great response. And you even said, Marky was well, I want to leave the space and the agency for people to have, the liberation they need, not just my own liberation. And so allowing the space for other people to liberate from whatever they've been oppressed from, I think is so kind, open. It's almost like it's a catch-22 a little bit. You can see it. It's like if you come to a gunfight with a knife, how well are you going to do? Probably not that well. But at the same time, you don't want, if you come to a gunfight with a gun, what happens? Everybody destroys everybody? You have to start kind of convincing people that will come to the gunfight to leave their guns at home, I guess. It's the only analogy I can come up with.
Yeah,
Right?
No, I hear the analogy, but we also have to be wary if we assume the gun is the superior tactic and or strategy.
Totally.
Right. And I say that, being a historian, if you will, in being cautious that certain indigenous groups around the world have won many battles without a gun.
Without a gun, that's true. That's a very good point, Marcus. It's true.
Yeah. But I think, again, the essence of this is really being aware of how we create space for others, really being critical of how a narrative is, pro one group and against, another group. And also really just asking, a question, and this one is maybe harder to understand, but it's a little bit of a reframe, but how are we designating what we consider as racial progress, right? How is that solution actually part of the problem? right?
Mhm.
Like, how's it actually expanding certain resources that were not requested and or needed by the group that is, being harmed in a sense? And so for some reason, again, we never ask, like, what I heard this the other day, like, we keep giving people the benefit of the doubt, but sometimes you need to doubt the benefit. Right.
I know.
Oh, stop right there, rewind, and say that again.
Again, we keep giving people the benefit of the doubt, but sometimes we need to doubt the benefit.
Ooh, wow, that says it all. Actually, now that I think about it, Mark, I don't know if you agree with me on this, but when the hard part of the work that Marcus does is that it's ongoing, and that it's sometimes hard to like just have one idea, because there's not like a fix all. But honestly, if you were to name some kind of idea to everything that we've just been talking about today, that would come pretty damn close.
I agree.
Because that hits the narrative, that hits the space about the narrative, the miscalculation of race and racism. Like, I mean, I feel like it encompasses those things. That's brilliant. That's
Have you ever said that line before, Marcus?
I have not, and I have to figure out who I give credit to, because I'm sure I heard it somewhere as well. And so
that's problem with reading too much stuff, right? Is like, it's all like it's in there.
Yes, definitely.
No, but it's regardless of where you heard it from, because obviously this is the twisting of thoughts is always it's always good to take something and flip it the other way and go, does it work the same way if you flip it, or
Definitely.
How's it working? I think the way that you positioned that and tied it to what we were talking about is brilliant. And to that, it's kind of unique in your own,
Thank you.
I got to add on to this, that I just thought back to the narrative of the lion and the narrative of the hunter. And I hear the hunter saying, well, listen, lion, I'm not keeping you on a leash anymore. Life is better, right? Why are you still complaining?
Yes.
And it's like, because we need to doubt the benefit. It's not a benefit that I'm walking around, without somebody calling me this or somebody calling me that. There's still more issues that are going on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There it is, Mark. You got it.
Oh man. If I got it, you delivered it.
No. We did this together. Together.
That's so good, Mark. Yes. That's where it hit me though, really hard too, is like, if I have to think about it now, I even have a question I can ask myself, Marcus. If I'm challenging something, the first question I'm going to ask is, who is this benefiting? Like, I should doubt the benefiter right away, right?
Definitely.
Instead of the other way around. I
Mhm.
should doubt the benefiter, and so go, okay, who's benefiting from this? That's the first and foremost question.
Definitely. Yeah. It's and also being aware of how it further expands the reach of the person who is actually benefiting.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of again, we had the brief conversation on reform, and I always think about reform as ultimately expanding the thing we were hoping to change or transform. That in itself is problematic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. I'm just so caught up on, again, this idea of doubting the benefit. And you think about, and you said it before, right? Like, when you talk about oppression, when you talk about liberation, you're not just talking about race. I mean, you're really talking about so many people, if not every person, deals with some kind of oppression.
Exactly.
And there's somebody on the opposite side who might think, hey, you got it better than you think it is. And it's like, no. Don't stop there. Don't get satisfied with, we've just got enough. I'm sorry. I'm just harping on that because it's so powerful. For me, it was just so powerful. And it was put in such a way that I think, Cathey, tell me if you agree with this, it was put in such a way that I think anybody can get that, right? And part of it is, and Cathey, you've taught this lesson so long ago that I just have to reiterate it. You've talked about taking a statement that people often hear and then finishing it up in a way that people are not used to hearing it, right? Yeah. Like, we give people benefit of the doubt. We're all familiar with that phrase. But by you adding that piece onto it at the end, it's almost like a shock to the system and what you call, Marcus, a truth gatherer. It's a truth to the system. Oh, man. Yeah. I just dropped my pen.
I know, I heard that. I was like, he like threw the pen down. I love Marcus, if you got Marc into a spot where he's not going to write anymore.
That's hey, I'll take that as a win. So
it's a win. It's a win like you don't know. You know, Marcus, again, I know, and I want to put this out there for the audience because, our job, Marc and I's job when we're, on this show, but in the profession that we live in, we're always trying to take ideas, and ideas are coming from everywhere about all kinds of things. And we're trying to just make it so that the person that has the idea can reach the widest amount of people. Like, they can go wide with the idea, but they can also go deep with it. There's plenty of depth to your knowledge and what you understand. And sometimes you have a little bit, what I would call, Marcus, I don't know if this is psychologically the right term for it, but the corruption of knowledge, meaning you're corrupted by your own knowledge because you have more knowledge. You think that people know what you know and they don't. And that corrupts the way that you maybe talk to people sometimes because they're not on the same level with you because you know more, if that makes sense. It's like, have you ever been in a car with somebody and you're telling them the way home and you forget to tell them something because you're corrupted with the knowledge that you know which turns and you're, oh shoot, turn left here. I forgot. Like, I'm so sorry. Yeah. I forgot you didn't know that. I think that when you can hit Marc, especially Marc, like if you can hit Marc in the face with that, like Marc's a thinker too. Like he's thinking a lot. I'm the marketer, right? I like to market. I like to be the one that put the words to it. Marc's thinking. And so for you to hit him like that, Marcus, I think, I don't know. I'm just saying, I think this is one of those spots where you can bookmark it and say, that's something we can do. We can palpably take to an audience or to this with this idea and say, hey, start here. Think about who this is going to benefit. Like, and doubt that's the first place to start with a narrative. Always doubt the person that's winning with it,
Definitely. And, maybe just in terms of, tangible actions, again, I think, it's easy for people to find resources and opinions that go against their, logic and rationale. And so, it's kind of like, when you're a kid, like, I don't like vegetables. And then you get older and you're like, wait, you can actually season these things, right? You can roast these things, right? You can do all these mushy things, right? Yeah, they don't have to be mushy and all the nutrients extracted from it because it's been boiled down. And so I think that's, a fair place to start in terms of like, what are these opinions that, might be separate than mine? But I also think you have to do a little deeper dive and find like, what is the actual analysis and rationale? Like, how have they defined the problem, right? Because you could just hear from another person's perspective and always reject it because you've defined the problem differently, right? And so how do you get around their analysis of how they've define this problem and what solutions are they pulling from, and just observe that no one's investigated or put resources behind how they've defined the problem and what they believe the solution is, right? I think that's valid. In some cases, we might be like, this person's just wild. I don't understand it. But if no one's ever put any resources behind it, and we're still talking about these same problems decades later, something got to change.
Okay, I finally did it, Marc. I didn't think it was going to happen. I started creating this concept. I was like, Marcus has enough concepts. He doesn't need another one, right? I was like, it's not going to happen this time. Marcus, it almost never happens to me because I'm always like, create a concept, create a concept, create a concept, right? I like drew a circle and I wrote benefiter, you know, the person benefiting. And then I was like, I started spoking out a couple of the things that you said, Marcus. How's the problem defined? I even put like, I don't think we said this explicitly, but who is it overlooked? Like, if there were like 3 pieces to this, like beneficiary, if you will, I think you could easily grab a couple of things that you could easily tell somebody in a second. First of all, think about who it's benefiting. How is it benefiting them? How is the problem being defined? Who is it overlooking? That immediately like creates a framework though, for me to do the correct kind of work, Marcus. I do think people get caught up in the, I don't know where to start. And it's like, here's a framework that makes it real easy in anything.
Yeah.
Remember the thing that happened to me, Marcus, with the Memorial Day?
Yeah.
It's like, I went to look up a quote and then I was like, the Black community came up with this well before, you know, and there's this whole other story behind it. Well, if I would have started with who's the benefiter, who was overlooked, I would have got to it a lot faster.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, and this is because I'm very critical of how some of these things just simply end up being an intellectual exercise, is that spend time and build relation with the lions.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
because
totally.
you can only read the books and still not build a relationship that fundamentally changes how you assess what the problem was in the first place. And so, you know, let's say within race and racism, like you can read about the issues of Black people, right? You can, you know, hear from all kinds of academics and stuff. But if you actually have no relationship with Black people, then the first time you engage with somebody, it's based off of what you read, and they might reject that, right? And so actually be in relationship, you know, with the lions, if you will. And that'll give you a much better analysis of the actual lions, their processing, their thinking, so on and so forth.
So instead of just seeing who is the overlooked, it's like sit with them,
you got to
befriend them, be in a relation with them.
You
understand. Have to. Yeah, totally. 100%. That's really good.
And even the process of getting there requires you to dismantle all of the programming you've been on in order to build an authentic relationship, right? You got to do the work yourself. The person who read the book and gave you the analysis can't do the work. And so by you being in community with them, you're actually doing the work.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's true, right?
That is. You know, it just reminds me of how so many people talk about, you know, you can read, you can take in knowledge, but it's like, what are you doing? It's great that you read 365 books this year,
exactly.
But what did you actually do with it, right?
Exactly.
Did you actually sit down and have a conversation with somebody about the knowledge that you have gathered? Mm-hmm. That was very powerful. And I got to say, the other thing that I think was powerful that I would love for people who are watching to walk away with is something you shared today is about the focus on the problem. And a lot of times, you know, Cathey, you know, you and I always talk about it, it's like problem solution. And we get so caught up, not we as in Cathey and I, but we as in the proverbial we, whoever the proverbial we and the proverbial they are,
we.
right? Get caught up in the solution that we don't spend enough time defining the problem and discussing the problem. Yes. And that is a very important part. There's a reason why it's called problem solution and not solution problem, right? Yeah. And we need to put more focus on defining each other's problems from each other's perspectives. Marcus, did I get that? Am I on the same wavelength with you on that one?
We here. Yes. I love it. You got my soul singing right now, so thank you.
Oh, I love that.
Well, Marcus, listen, we started off with this idea of how do people understand the miscalculation of race and racism? And we have had, I think, in your words, a radical discussion about this topic. And we're curious, for you, how has the idea transformed or evolved since we first started this conversation?
Yeah, that's a powerful question. And I always come back to being critical of how we build community. At the end of the day, we can read whatever books, extract whatever analysis we want. But how are we actually building community to create material changes for people? I don't care what a book says, right? It can be informative, and it can also, as we've witnessed, be harmful. But if I can say, hey, Marc, Cathey, let's break bread, right? And be open to this idea that you may not like the same things I eat, right? You know, we might have a different method of exchanging currency. That's okay. But let me build that with you. Not let me come to the table and say, Marc, Cathey, we got to meet here. You got to eat this on the menu. You got to pay this way, et cetera, right? And so again, like let's make sure we're informed, and let's track the opinions and perspectives that have been marginalized. But even further than that, let's start to build community, build relationships and community with those groups, because that is actually what will better inform our analysis and help us understand we've been tracking the wrong things. You know, we should not be throwing out holidays. Instead, we should be creating material changes for these groups. We should be changing our culture in a way that doesn't require an ally anymore, right? In a way that says we all have the authority to speak on our behalf and to have that empowered, right? To have systems change because someone said they can no longer deal with these constructs. Not to say, okay, let's make it a vote. And if I agree that it's worthy of my attention, then I'll affirm that right. That's problematic. That's harmful. Yeah. And so I'll leave it there because it's bringing up other ideas.
Well, Marcus,
that just means we're going to have another conversation, right, Cathey?
We absolutely are. I'll just take my piece of where I feel like it's changed for me too. Really strong on the community end, Marcus. I definitely will +1 that in a huge way. I think you cannot make any real change unless you sit with communities that you're not used to sitting with. And you don't have to share, like you said, you don't have to share the same soggy vegetables if one person has soggy vegetables and the other has, you don't have to, but to sit in the communities that you're not used to, I think is a big takeaway for me.
Well, Marcus, here's my question. For the lion and the hunter who would like to get together to have these conversations, who understand that you're not here simply to give a TED Talk. You're not simply here to write another book. You're here to really spark conversations between the lions and the hunters and everybody else. How do people find out about you? How do people find you so that they can be a part of this conversation?
That's a great question. LinkedIn is going to be easy to find me. I do post from time to time to there. Outside of that, I think I'm very active on Twitter. And my Twitter handle is just growth_atlas. And so you could find me there as well. If you're inclined, and I encourage everybody to take me up on this offer, you can reach me on my email, just marcus@teamcinder.com. And I'm always willing to engage in these conversations, whether it's one-on-one, or I believe we got to do it collectively, right? The lion has a family, right? The hunter has a family, right? We're on this family of Earth and this planet, right? And so we got to do it as collectives. But that's how you can reach me. And again, I definitely encourage all of us to engage in these conversations and be open. Like I said, there's other narratives we have to explore to make sure, 15, 20, 100 years from now, we're still not regurgitating these concepts of race and racism that you could pick up a book and say, in the 1700s, they said the same thing. In the 1500s, they said that. Why am I talking about this in 2021?
Yeah.
You're right. You're right. You're right. Well, listen, for anybody out there who wants to engage in the conversation, and for anybody out there who wants to start a new conversation with another idea and wants to sit down with Cathey and I, check out our website. It's About to Go Down Show. Send us an email at marcandcathey@gmail.com. We are ready to take ideas and help you to reach more people and have a bigger impact on this planet. So with that said, we hope everybody enjoyed this episode. Marcus, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And everybody, check out another episode coming soon of It's About to Go Down.